This video will be all about how to reclaim your clay at home. I'll take you through all the steps of what to do with your fresh clay that you get in a bag, through the steps of slaking it down into slip, and then re-drying it out on a surface to make it reworkable and able to use again. So clay often, most times if you buy it commercially, it comes in 50-pound boxes, and it comes in 2 bags within that 50-pound box. So it's usually broken down into 25 pounds of clay wrapped in a plastic bag, a very thick plastic bag. So it does tend to stay pretty moist for a fairly long time. But with your clay at home, you'll have a bag to take care of and of course use for different various projects. But to know what to do throughout those stages, that's what this is about. So you'll see, hopefully you can see that I have a spray bottle. I highly recommend investing in one that has a nozzle where you can change how it sprays, like the mist. So you can see it's just a nice, hopefully you can see it's a nice, just a mist. You don't want a real darting squirt of water coming out, just a nice overall mist on the clay. And we have some clay here. This is fresh, obviously workable clay. You can see it's just all squishy. And then I have these pieces here that it's hard to see, but I have various pieces of clay that I just dried out overnight. You can kind of see, and I will take and show you that. So it was really just dried clay, wet clay, that I broke up with my fingers, just in bits of pieces. And I have an example to show you. Say this was a piece of clay that you were going to make whatever with, and you don't need that piece, or you don't like that piece, you don't want to fire that piece, you can then just simply break it apart once it gets to be bone dry stage. And bone dry is just when it's very warm to the touch. You can put it up to your cheek, and if you don't feel any moisture to it, you know that it's completely bone dry. And bone dry means that all the water has evaporated from the clay. So this is a piece of just a little pancake pinch piece that I made. And I made this yesterday out of fresh clay. And I just dried it outside overnight. And it was a pretty humid summer day, so it took longer than usual to dry out. Sometimes it dries out within hours, depending on how dry. But throwing a lot of information out at you at one time, just try to absorb it as much as you can. And this is great because of videos. You can rewatch it if you need to see the material again. So this piece is, again, bone dry, so you can break it. It just breaks very easily. So if there's any clay that you know, as you're working and you don't want to save it, meaning you don't want to fire it, you don't want it to be permanent, you just want to reclaim it, recycle it is what reclaim means. It just simply means you're recycling it to reuse it. Because that's a great thing about clay, is if it's not fired at all, you can constantly reconstitute it. So that just means you can break it down with water, slake it down, and that's again what I'm showing you, this process. So these little bits of pieces that you have with your clay as you work, you can see, hopefully you can see, it really does flake and there's dust that accumulates. That's something you really want to be mindful of. You don't want the dust to drop on the floor, lay on tables, surfaces, and then not clean it up. It's important that you try to work as clean as possible because, you know, over time, the small dust particles are not healthy for our lungs and it's not safe to breathe. So you just want to be careful about that. Invest in a good sponge, wipe down your surfaces when you clean up, and it's very important, just a good practice to get into. So I've got all these clay pieces, and what I'm going to do is this empty plastic container, I'm going to open the lid, take the lid off, and I'm going to just take all these bits of clay and put them in here. do this while you're working. You don't have to have them all dried out, you know. As you work, you can slowly dry your pieces of clay out and then have a container like so to just keep adding. So then you won't have a lot of reclaim to take care of at one time. Got all my bits and pieces there in this container. It's either all dry, crumbly. And then again, you can always take your shard of clay as you work. I did this to save some time because I needed to dry to show you, but it just, again, it just snaps apart, and that's how you know it's bone dry. And then you want to have your water, and you'll get supplied with, I believe, 2 yogurt plastic containers with lids, but I do have water, and I'm going to show you how much to pour. You're just going to pour about right up to the top. You know, you don't want to fill it like this inches higher than the clay bits because it is going to slake down, and you don't want it to, you know, you can get as liquidy as possible, but then the more liquid that you add, the more sloppy and messy and liquefied it is, like slurry. It's funny, it's making this like nice little bubbling sound. It's already starting to break down. So you can add a little bit. You can also press it down with your hands. There's no like one set way to do this, of course. You can add a little bit more water, a little less. It's something that you can keep checking on. You can keep adding to it, you know, but if I were you, if I had a container this big, I would just keep, you know, filling this. I would keep adding the bone dry clay to this container till it was like 3/4 the way full, because then you can add water to it. You still need to remember to save room for the water because it's going to slake down, and it's going to, you know, be a little bit more than what you have here. So I'll set that aside. And I did start one too to show you what the consistency is like. So I did this same step, same way yesterday in this container. And overnight it became like this gluey, slurry paste. And that's what's called slip. So you can see it's nice and smooth and fun to play with. But that's slip, and that means the glue that we use to attach things with clay, handles, joined slabs. You'll see all that down the road, but for now, that's what slip is. And that's obviously too wet to work with, right? So you're going to need some slip. It's always nice to have, but for most hand building work, you don't need a lot of slip, if any. So the idea of this video is to show you how to reclaim the clay, and which that means is turn it back into workable clay. So workable clay like this. So we went from the dry bits, the dry bone dry clay, to the slip by adding some water, slaking it down. And then you want to find a container. This is just a baking dish. You could use a Tupperware dish. You could use a plastic dish. You don't really have to have a dish underneath here. If you don't have one, it's okay. You just really want to be careful not to put in slip that's really, really watered down. If it's not the consistency that I showed you, you definitely want to put some sort of thing to catch the excess water underneath. And then you want to find a towel. I'm using an old t-shirt, and I'm just going to lay that into the baking pan. It's just a bread pan. You don't want to use something like plastic because that won't allow the water to absorb. So you want to have some sort of absorbent cloth material, maybe a tea towel, and you want to be careful too with the towel that you use. If the towel has a lot of fibers on it, the clay is going to stick to that, and the fibers are going to just, the cloth material is going to get into the clay, and that's not ideal. So you really want to try to find some sort of material that will be absorbent, but yet not have a lot of fibers on the outside of it to interact with the clay. So then you want to take your slip, and you just are going to pour in that into here. And so you can see, almost looks like a loaf of bread. And then you're going to just sit that overnight, or maybe longer, maybe less. You want to keep checking on it. And if it's late and you're not going to be able to check it for a few hours, just cover a piece of, put a piece of plastic on top of it, but just kind of keep checking it as you can. And then you will see it will slowly dry and it'll pull off the piece of fabric and it will turn into workable clay. It almost like a pancake. If you think of how a pancake cooks on one side, you may have to flip it and dry the other side. You may have to take a spoon, just your fingers works great to knead it, to turn it over. It just really depends on what kind of environment you have, because it is all dependent on how, if you're outside, of course, obviously I'm outside. If it was inside, your heat might be on. It's not summer, but it's still hot. If you have air conditioning, there's a lot of variables into the temperature of where you're working, really factors into how fast or slow your clay dries. So I will continue this, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Again, I have dust here. So you want to take your sponge or a wet, damp cloth and make sure you clean that really well. Nothing should go down the sink. You don't want to go into your home and put a lot of clay slurry or clay liquid at all into your sink. So just be careful about that. I'm outside, so I just kind of tossed it. And then what you want to be sure to do, last thing I want to just go over, is how to cover clay. Once you have the clay turned back to workable clay, you can take your plastic. These are just 13-gallon plastic bags. And open that up, put your clay in, and cover it nice and tight. Like that. And I would leave that as a good place for storing your clay. So hopefully that'll be helpful for you to see. And I wish you all good luck in finding your own way to do that.